Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Jalal Khashib. I'm a senior research associate at CIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. And I would like to welcome you all to the third session of our third international conference on Islamophobia, examining the global war on terror, challenges, policies, and consequences. The chair session is my colleague Üveys Khan. He will moderate this session, and Üveys is the senior research associate at CIGA, and he is a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion at Syracuse University. He served as a lecturer at Fatih Sultan Mehmed University's Alliance of Civilization Institute in Istanbul between 2010 and 2012, and he helped to found its graduate program. His main field of interest are political philosophy, the modern state, and Islamic political theory and practice. Please, Üveys, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jalal. We are excited to have a great panelist, a great panel on our second sitting for today. The conference, as you know, is spanning over a couple of days. Today, we are going to be examining the topic, the topic redefining the global war on terror, who is the terrorist? I will begin by introducing our panelists and our participants, and then I will hand it over to each panelist for them to speak for about roughly 20 minutes each, and we will then move to question and answers. I want to welcome everybody, including the audience that is tuning in from Facebook and other social media platforms. These are very timely and very important topics that concern not just the Muslim world, but the world at large. So I am very honored that everybody is here for such an important discussion. First and foremost, I want to introduce Professor Hamid Mousavi, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the University of Tehran. Professor Mousavi is a longtime participant here at CIGA. We've invited him many occasions. He is a specialist on Israeli foreign policy, US foreign policy, and Middle East politics. He is currently writing a book on the ideology in Israeli foreign policy. Welcome, Professor Hamid. I would also like to introduce Dr. Jeenah, who is an academic and leader from South Africa. He is an anti-war, anti-capitalist activist, and also the executive director for the Afro-Middle Eastern Center. He has taught many courses at various universities, both in the Muslim world and abroad. He also does training programs related to Islam in South Africa, and we are very honored to have him. Welcome, Dr. Naim. Lastly, we have our director, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who is also, he is a professor based at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. He is a director of CIGA. He needs no introduction, so I will go ahead and move along, if you don't mind, Professor Sami. I think that,
not at all.
Okay, so I will first hand the floor to Professor Mousavi for him to speak. Professor Mousavi, if you have a PowerPoint presentation, you can share your screen at this time. The floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Üveys. I'd like to first of all say hello to all the viewers as well as my fellow panelists. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Please let me know when you're able to see it. Is it viewable now?
Yes, yes, it's on the screen. If you could just enlarge it.
Yes. Is it okay now?
It's perfect now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about the topic of terrorism and representation. The term terrorism has a, I would say, simple definition. If you look at the Oxford Dictionary, it's defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. The United Nations defines it as a commonly understood to refer to acts of violence that target civilians in the pursuit of political or ideological aims. Nevertheless, the UN indicates that there is no single definition that is adopted by the entire international community. So there are a variety of definitions. Nevertheless, I would say that if you look at the various definitions, you would see several important things. It's first of all, the use of violence against civilians is very highlighted usually. And there's also the angle of using politics and ideology as a goal. So violence is used as a means to attain ideological and political aims. And even if you look at the definition of the FBI, you see the same pattern. So the FBI actually has two definitions, one for international terrorism and one for domestic terrorism. And if you can I'll read it for you. For international terrorism, it defines it as violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups who are inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations or nations. And for domestic terrorism, it uses a similar definition, except it's not associated with foreign terrorist organizations. So as you can see in these definitions, they are pretty similar. Here's the main issue, though. The main issue is, how are these definitions of terrorism applied to real world examples? So who gets to decide what acts constitute as terrorism and which act does not constitute as terrorism? And as you read in these definitions that we talked about, the issue of using violence and intimidation, we can clearly see that it's not just restricted to individuals, but also groups as well as nations. So say if a country attacks another country without good reason or without the approval of the United Nations Security Council, say what happened in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there is a very significant amount of violence used against civilians, and of course there's a lot of intimidation. But the issue of what constitutes as terrorism and what does not constitute as terrorism is actually a political move, a political act, and this is what's really important. So the decision to categorize a violent act as terrorism or not as terrorism is actually a political move that is usually decided by positions of power. So if we're talking about domestic terrorism, it's usually the police force, the security forces of each country who gets to decide what is terrorism and what is not terrorism. And when we're talking about international terrorism, again, there's the issue of more powerful countries getting to decide what constitutes as terrorism and what does not constitute as terrorism. One cartoon that I really like from the Family Guy, this is a cartoon that actually shows what constitutes as terrorism domestically in the United States. So as you can see, the police officer having a booklet where the color of skin actually indicates what is a violent act that was conducted by someone who's mentally ill, whereas if the same act was conducted by a brown or black person, then that would be constituted as terrorism. So again, going back to what I was saying, it's a political decision. It's a political move where it's decided if something is terrorism or not. And we have this both domestically as well as internationally. So if we move on from there, what I'm going to talk about, if we want to look at this from an academic perspective, I would really use a theoretical framework called critical geopolitical studies. And what critical geopolitical studies is that it questions the assumptions of what we constitute as world politics and geopolitical studies. So the very fact that we categorize the world, that we talk about power relations, that we talk about geographies and the politics associated with these geographies are based on assumptions that are taken for granted. So if in contrast to geopolitical studies, normal geopolitical studies, which takes geopolitics as a objective reality, critical geopolitical studies questions the so-called objectiveness of the geopolitics that we are studying. And as a result, questions of representation, questions of how world politics is defined comes to the center. And the main aim of critical geopolitical studies is to expose the power relations that get to decide the so-called geopolitical facts that everyone takes for granted. So according to geopolitical studies, the issue of representation is very important. Why is it important? It's because narratives that give a special representation to different parts of the world allow, facilitate, and legitimize specific foreign policies. So to put that in simple terms, as an example, the representation of people living in the Middle East or Arabs or Muslims in general facilitate and legitimize specific foreign policies adopted by, say, the US government. And this is why the representation of other people is very important. One quote that I usually use that is by Shapiro, as you can read, says, "The process of making the foreign or exotic and thus different from the self, someone or thing." So this is the issue of representation. He's defining what representation is. And what is the result of that? What is the consequence of that? Given the usual esteem within which the self is constituted, the exoticizing of the other almost invariably amounts to the constitution of the other as a less than equal subject. So essentially what he's trying to say is that when you define the so-called foreign or exotic as being different from yourself, then essentially you're exoticizing the other and you're bringing them on a level that is lower than the level that you consider yourself or your nation or your country. And the consequence of that is, again, it allows for aggressive foreign policies by the country that is doing the representation. Now, if we want to bring this into the context of terrorism in the Middle East and Muslims, I mean, the viewers, you've all seen various films and series that depict Muslims and Arabs as, the villains. They stereotype them as being evil, as being terrorist by nature. as not responding to logic or reason, and this is very important. When we talk about, for example, U.S. relations with X or Y or Z Muslim country, a lot of discussion in academia is that we have to adopt harsh or aggressive policies towards these countries because they don't follow reason or because they don't follow logic. So when you say that why is Britain or France or the United States allowed to have weapons of mass destruction where the same weapons are banned for other countries, usually the answer you get is because, well, these countries follow a pattern of reason, they follow logic, whereas other countries cannot be trusted with such weapons because, again, if you go back to the culture or to the religion, it's evil, and there's different subsets of how they are stereotyped, and I'll get to that. And you see this in more recent films as well. So the one on the left is True Lies, which, if I'm not mistaken, is from the 1990s, and The Kingdom is after post 9/11. And you see this in various series as well. So these pictures are, for example, from Homeland, which is a very popular series in the US. I'm a fan of Homeland myself. But if you've seen Homeland, you know that the seasons that are based in the Middle East give a very negative image of Middle Eastern people. And again, these series, you have to look at this as not being random or not just one Hollywood screenwriter writing something. It's not as simple as that. For example, in the case of Homeland, one of the main screenwriters is actually a former CIA official. So you do see a lot of connections between the security establishment as well in Hollywood, especially when it comes to films involving terrorism or intelligence matter or spying, etc. One example is the series The Americans, which is regarding the KGB spying on U.S. soil, and it's based in the Cold War. The screenplay is actually given to the CIA on a weekly basis, or let me correct that, was given to the CIA on a weekly basis. The series is over now, and the CIA actually would go over the screenplay every week and essentially make changes to the screenplay. So again, it's not as simple or honest, or if you look at this and say, well, these are just maybe some just honest exaggerations, it's not as simple as that. Again, this is not only the US. These pictures are from a series called Tehran, which is a Israeli series regarding Israeli spy operations in Tehran. It's actually a pretty good series. And interestingly enough, I would say that compared to Hollywood, actually, this is much more nuanced, and it actually gives I wouldn't say balanced, but at least more balanced representation compared to, say, Homeland, which is interesting again. But if we go back to what I was saying about, and I'm conscious of my time, so I'm going to end at 20 minutes, Üveys. If you look at the pattern of this, and if you study it, the most brilliant scholar that has worked on this is Jack Shaheen. God rest his soul. He died a few years ago, and he was a Lebanese Christian professor at Southern Illinois University. I think he died in 2017. And his most famous book, which is called Real Bad Arabs. And this is a very famous book on the issue of Arab representation in Hollywood. And Jack Shaheen studied 1,000 Hollywood films made between 1896, so this is the very beginnings of Hollywood, until 2000, and this is before 9/11, mind you. So over 100 years, and Jack Shaheen actually looked at 1,000 Hollywood films where Arabs were portrayed. And interestingly enough, he found that Arabs were portrayed negatively in 936 of those 1,000 movies, so over 90%. And he found that there were 4 categorization of how Arabs were portrayed in these movies. So there was the Arab terrorist, which was always portrayed as evil and causing explosions, shootings, stabbings, etc. There was also the shallow or silly Arab character that was naive, stupid, and he or she was full of fun, lust, and extravagance. Then you had the Arab Bedouin character, which was very far from civilization and science, and they were usually accompanied by tents and camels. I mean, you still see this, the tents and camels images even in Hollywood today. And then finally, the 4th Arab character was nervous, repressive of women, and very far from emotions and romance. So 4 Arab characters, with the very first one, the foremost one, being the Arab terrorist. And mind you, again, this is all pre-9/11, and this is pre-ISIS and pre-Iraq invasion of 2003. This is mostly in the 20th century. And again, he found that 90%, over 90% of the films he monitored represented Arabs negatively. I remember that when I first read the book, even someone who studies this kind of a thing, I found that a lot of the movies he mentioned, I had actually not noticed that Arabs and Muslims were being represented negatively. And this goes all the way back to the issue of, after a while, it gives you an image that is part of your subconscious. So you might look at something. One example in his book, for example, is the cartoon of Aladdin, which was, I think, made in 1992. And if you look at Aladdin, maybe you don't even notice the negative aspects it is showing regarding Arabs. But again, if you study the book, you'll see that there's a pattern of how Muslims and Arabs are represented in Hollywood. And this negative portrayal of Arabs is actually heightened after the war of 1967, the Six-Day War. And it becomes even worse after 1973, so the so-called Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo. And this goes back to the issue where I was saying that the act of categorizing something as terrorism or someone as a terrorist is always a political move. This does not mean that it's not connected to the real world. It is, but again, it's a political move made by politicians and by people of power. And Jack Shaheen has a second book which he wrote after 9/11, and as you can see, the title is Guilty, and Jack Shaheen is essentially analyzing of whether Hollywood, what is the verdict regarding Arabs after 9/11, and the verdict is guilty. So I have 2 more slides and then I'll stop. This slide is actually, I want to point out that this method of negatively representing and portraying other people to serve a political foreign policy agenda is not something new. It was actually used by many great powers and many empires. One example, which I don't know if you noticed or not, but from the very famous movie, The Gladiator, which I personally really like, if you remember the opening scene of Gladiator, um, it showed a war between German tribes and the Roman army of Marcus Aurelius. And if you go and study the history of these wars, so these are the Marcomannic Wars, which took place between 166 and 180 AD. And the wars are actually the German tribes trying to push back the Roman invaders, which had invaded German territory in prior decades. So in fact, in reality, the Romans are the conquerors, they are the invaders, and the German tribes are trying to defend their territory. But if you remember the opening scene from the film, the Roman army is shown as orderly, it's shown as civilized, it's shown as ethical, it's shown as rule-based. So every decision is based on rules, is based on ethics, etc. Whereas the tribes, again, if you remember the picture on the right, their leader holding the head of the messenger the Romans had sent. So the Romans had sent a messenger to negotiate, hopefully to reach an agreement, but these people are savages, and they actually killed the messenger. And from the film, these people are shown as dirty, uncivilized, people who use brute force. They are very violent, and they are very, very far from the civilization of the Roman Empire. And again, this is not something that is limited to this special film. It actually goes back to the Roman Empire, which defined itself as the pinnacle of civilization, and as other people who were at war with, as these brute tribes that the Roman Empire was civilizing. So the issue of representation is very important, and it's really important in the sense that it gives legitimacy to expansive foreign policies, to aggressive foreign policies. My last slide is actually the viewpoint of Americans regarding foreign countries, and this is done by Gallup. It's actually done routinely since the 1980s, and usually it's done every single month. And you can see how Americans perceive other countries using this survey. Usually at the top of the list of the most favorable countries, you find countries such as Canada, the United Kingdom, which is expected. And near the bottom of the list, the most unfavorable countries are usually the last one, which was done in February of this year. The most negatively viewed country was, first of all, North Korea, and after that it was Iran. So if you look at, I've brought 4 countries, and if you look at that, we have Palestine, Iran, and Iraq. And if you look at those numbers, there is slight changes, but all 3 are mostly seen unfavorably. So for example, in the case of Palestine, only 5% of Americans view Palestine as very favorable, 25% mostly favorable, and 41% mostly unfavorable, and 24% very unfavorable. With Iran, it actually even gets worse, where a grand majority, like over 85% of Americans view the country as unfavorably. And if you compare those numbers, say, with Israel, which has actually lost a little bit of territory in the past decade, but still, you see that in the Middle East, Israel is seen very favorably among the countries in the Middle East, among Americans. And this all goes back to the issue of representation and how it facilitates certain foreign policies. Okay, I'll stop right there. I think my time is over. Thank you, Üveys. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed. I will now give the floor to Mr. Naeem. Mr. Naeem, if you could, unmute your mic. Okay. We'll have question and answers after we have all the presentations.
Shukran, Üveys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My topic is to talk about 20 years after the, or 20 years after the war on terror was initially spoken about or conceived. So I'm going to start by asking a stupid question, just so that I can answer it, which is a good tactic to start a speech with, I suppose. 20 years later, is there still a war on terror? We've gone through the Barack Obama era, we've gone through the Trump era, now into Biden, and there has been a school of thought that under Trump, of course, with the America First kind of idea, that the war on terror was no longer primary and was kind of put on the back burner. In fact, even in the Obama era, the language had somewhat changed. But if we consider, for example, the US State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism appointed by Donald Trump, Nathan Sales, said to the BBC recently, last year, June, when asked whether the war on terror was now over, he said, no, the fight is very much ongoing. We are winning the fight, but we are continuing to fight against a determined enemy, or I should say a determined group of enemies. The last three words, I think, are quite important because it's not just an enemy. Saying a group of enemies means you can make it mean whoever the hell you want it to make it mean. Since September 2001, the war on terror has, until the end of 2020, the war on terror has displaced between 37 and 59 million people across the world, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. It estimates that conservatively, that 8 of the most violent counter-terror wars, counter-terror in quotes, the US government has engaged in since 2001, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Philippines, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, have produced 8 million refugees and 29 million internally displaced people. This is a huge amount of, a huge number of people that we're talking about being displaced from their homes as a result of this kind of policy. So the point I'm making is that it's not just about words and ideology. It has serious impact on huge numbers of people in different parts of the world. Moving from Obama, of course, well, as I said, in the Obama era, the language kind of changed a little bit. So the term global war on terror wasn't something that was very much used in the Obama era. The rhetoric changed, but substantively, there was no rupture in American policy since 2001 and George Bush's speech. Obama famously, of course, we know, was responsible for authorizing more than 1,800 drone attacks, killing a good number of people in different parts of the world. Trump, for all his America First, launched more than that in terms of drone attacks in his first 2 years. Now with the Biden era, in a new strategy paper from a few weeks ago, the paper called Renewing America's Advantages, Interim National Security Strategic Guidance. It says that the United States should not and will not engage in forever wars that have cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. It points to America's, quote, America's longest war in Afghanistan, as well as in Yemen, and talks about helping to end Africa's deadliest conflicts and prevent the onset of new ones. So again, a different kind of rhetoric, one that actually sounds even more positive than the past two presidents, but in reality what that means, we will have to wait and see. Let me just make a note here of two dates that in a sense for us suggest the beginnings of this so-called war on terror. The first is the 14th of October 2001, the invasion of or the bombing, the beginning of the bombing of Afghanistan, and the second, the 19th of March 2003, which was the beginning of the invasion of Iraq. And everything since then is history, but nevertheless, I have to talk about it. More importantly, in terms, in the context of this conference and the link between the global war on terror and Islamophobia, the language has changed to include the various other terms that we heard a lot about in the previous session, particularly from Asim Qureshi. Prevent, countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, all of those kinds of things. Changing language, but same effect. Now, one thing about wars is that usually when a war is embarked on, there's some sense of a goal, some sense of clarity about what the end game is, some sense of an understanding about what victory means. With this so-called war on terror or global war on terror, whichever one might prefer, there's no clarity about what victory is. And hence, when we look at, and I'm not going to quote any of these things anymore, but if we look at some of these policy documents from Obama to Trump to Biden now, and the think tanks that advise these administrations, the sense you get is that the notion of what a victory in this war on terror is keeps changing in a way that it becomes quite blurry, so that anything can be regarded as a victory, but not enough of a victory. It can be a victory if it's useful for propaganda purposes, but it's not enough of a victory because the war must go on. And so whether the language changes, that's what it would be called. Now, let me make a slight detour here. If we're talking about the war on terror and that discourse, we can't limit ourselves only to what the United States refers to this as, or for that matter, what the United States and its allies, Europe, etc., refer to it as. Importantly, I think we need to consider, particularly because of the theme of the conference, we need to consider Muslim responses as well to the war on terror. And I'll mention in a while about Muslim states, but I want to make a mention here of Muslims in civil society rather than Muslim states, and particularly I think Muslims in Western countries, and many of us that are in this conference or are participating in this conference are from these countries. Of course, there was a small group, and there continues to be a small group of Muslims across the world who support extremism, who support violent extremism, or whatever else you might want to call it. But there have been large numbers of Muslims from, or large numbers, I'm not talking about hundreds of millions, large numbers in terms of the noise that is being made, large numbers of Muslims from 2001 who have responded to this global war on terror discourse and the attacks on Muslims and Muslim countries through a kind of particular kind of script. Their response has been a form of Muslim intolerance and even takfir. So, for example, the Taliban are not Muslims. Al-Qaeda is not Muslim. Osama bin Laden is not Muslim. More recently, Abu Bakr Baghdadi is not Muslim. ISIS are not Muslims. Boko Haram is not Muslim. All of these kinds of takfiri things, of course, they'd be horrified if I were to accuse them of, well, I am accusing them. They'd be horrified to hear my accusation that they've engaged in takfir because they believe that they are the most tolerant Muslims around, and that's why, in fact, they engage in this kind of takfir. And so it sounds odd because these are the people who ground their arguments in the notion that Islam is tolerant and peaceful and therefore should not be opposing empire. And in fact, that the greatest threat to the world is so-called Muslim fundamentalism. Many of them also claim that they oppose, quote, the takfiris. Over the past 20 years, this kind of Muslim discourse has changed a little, but not completely. It still is very much a reality. And what we've also seen over the past few years, again, referring to the earlier session and the connections that were made in that session, what we've also seen is that this kind of Muslim takfiri discourse has fed in quite well with Zionist Islamophobic discourse. And so in the US, for example, you have groups like Engage and MLI, etc. So the discourse has changed somewhat because, I say somewhat, because for many others of us, there is a greater awareness since 2001 of what the bigger picture actually is and what the bigger agenda actually is and what the role of empire is in all of this, in the so-called global war on terror and in the Islamophobic discourses. The Bush, you are either with us or with the terrorists, has of course been extremely useful, extremely useful dictum for dictators and authoritarians across the world. Asim Qureshi in the earlier session spoke quite well about how the Chinese and the American discourse kind of played off each other in terms of demonizing and oppressing and the beginnings of the genocide against the Uyghur people. Both of these, the Chinese, of course, used that notion of with us or with the terrorists quite effectively. The Americans bought into that, and together, in a sense, they manufactured a particular kind of consent around the Uyghurs. Of course, Israel has been one of those countries that was first of the starting blocks with this, using the terrorism discourse from 2001, from immediately after the September attacks, to talk about how its agenda was exactly the same as the American agenda in fighting terrorism and in this war against terror. But there's also been, of course, other countries. Egypt has used that discourse very effectively against all forms of dissent. Certainly we saw it right up to 2011, and then again 2013 it was ratcheted up after the coup in Egypt. Saudi Arabia has employed that same kind of rhetoric internally as well as externally, most recently externally in terms of Yemen. The UAE in terms of, in terms of anything to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. Syria in terms of all forms of opposition, political or military in that country, as has on different occasions Iran and many other countries. I'll mention a few African countries in a moment. In fact, very few countries are innocent in that they have not at all participated in this American-launched war on terror. Again, in the earlier session, the example was mentioned of Maher Arar, the Canadian who was shipped off by the US to Syria, but he was by no means the only one who was shipped off to Syria to be tortured and interrogated. Syria was one of those well-known and very useful black spots for the US, where it could export its torture to. Even my own country, South Africa, Khalid Mahmoud Rashid was kidnapped and flown off to Pakistan, where he was tortured and interrogated there. So Pakistan, of course, and many other countries. Very few countries, as I said, have remained innocent in terms of this war on terror, and I think that we all need to reflect on that carefully. Of course, a big question, and I don't know why I'm doing this. I keep saying, as was mentioned in an earlier session, it seems like, you know, my entire presentation is quite redundant. But as mentioned in an earlier session, the discourse and the rhetoric of war on terror is not really used against right-wing and fascist terror. Whether we're talking about the United States or Europe, or in various countries of the global South. So far, right-wing terror in the US and in Europe, even when the term terrorism is very reluctantly used, is prefaced with the word domestic. And so if the perpetrators are Muslims, then it is by implication foreign. If the perpetrators are not Muslim and white, then it's domestic. And somehow the connotation of that is a bit different, especially when in the US, for example, there's a ratcheting up of a discourse against foreigners, against immigrants and all of that. That makes this even more so. And so it also perpetuates the notion of Islam as foreign and entrenches the war on terror as a tool of and a promoter of Islamophobia. So there's no doubt that the war on terror is really about Muslims. It's not about terrorism, however you might define that. And thank you, Hamid, for a very long explanation of what that might mean. But it has become, and perhaps it was from the very beginning, about Muslims. And therefore, being about Muslims, it is also then a kind of racist discourse. And as I said, it continues to be extremely useful, not only in the US, not only for imperialist objectives, but extremely useful for dictators, authoritarians, and fascists in all our countries. The merging of Islamophobia with anti-terrorism discourse is also something that we're seeing increasingly. And again, you know, this means that it's related to Muslims, of course, in Europe, in India, in China. And let me take a moment to just mention about India, for example. It is clear that in India there is a strong anti-Muslim Islamophobic imperative in the politics generally, and in the kind of hegemonic discourse or the discourses that have become hegemonic there. But this is also useful. The Islamophobia and the war on terror discourse that it feeds off is also useful for a bigger project, a bigger political project that targets a range of other people, not just Muslims. The Hindutva project in India requires the demonization of Muslims, but also the demonization of Christians, of Sikhs, of Dalits, and a whole range of other religious, ethnic, and socio-cultural groups. And so in some senses, many of these other targets have in India become kind of honorary Muslims. On the African continent, and I'm not sure how I'm doing for time.
You've got 5 more minutes. You could conclude if you.
Okay, I'm going to try and do it in less.
If you so wish.
Yeah, I'm going to try and do it in less than that. On the African continent, that discourse continues to be useful, both in countries that have majority Muslim populations, such as in Egypt, for example, I mentioned earlier on, and in Morocco, internally within Morocco, but also in terms of the Western Sahara, or the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, and the war that Morocco is waging on that entity. Somalia, another Muslim country. Mali, Niger, Muslim majority countries, and also Nigeria, Kenya. In many of these countries, we find these discourses, the Islamophobic and war on terror discourses, which, as I said, feed off each other. In many of these countries, we find these discourses are used by the local power elites, by the rulers, in order to criminalize dissent and crush dissent, but also used by foreign powers in order to do the same with the collaboration of the locals. So, for example, we can talk about Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and the role of AFRICOM and the French. Therefore, AFRICOM, of course, the US Africa Command, and the French there. The French footprint in that part of the world, in West Africa, is quite huge, substantial, and very powerful. AFRICOM, you know, by latest figures, 2019, 2020, carries out either training exercises or operations on the African continent of around 700 in a year. That's almost 2 per day. Either operations or training exercises, increasing number of bases on the continent, and the terrorism and war on terror discourse is extremely useful in order for them to be able to do that. Of course, the French and the Americans are not the only ones with military bases on the African continent, and other kinds of such bases. You're also thinking of the Chinese, the UAE, Turkey, and others. Let me end with something closer to home for me, and that is the case of Mozambique, particularly northern Mozambique. Northern Mozambique has become the latest, newest, most recent front in the war on terror. Just last week, week before last week, US troops arrived in Mozambique, ostensibly in order to provide training. But there are eyewitness reports now that we have that suggest that it's more than just training. There are also Portuguese troops, the French trainers, military trainers, etc., that are there, South African mercenaries that are present in northern Mozambique. Now, why am I mentioning northern Mozambique? Because this is part of the country that is majority Muslim. The insurgency there is regarded by virtually everyone as being a Muslim insurgency. One of the groups that is part of the insurgency early last year affiliated itself to ISIS, which affiliation in real terms doesn't really mean much, but nevertheless it's there. And so it is now part of that global war on terror. And it is part of that growing kind of Islamophobia in this region, in this part of the African continent, that in many ways has tried to keep away from both of these things. We find very useful in terms of northern Mozambique reports coming out from the Catholic Church there, by the way, and I know this because I'm the deputy chairperson of an organization that belongs to the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, which deals with conflict resolution, and we receive at least one report a week from northern Mozambique, from the bishop and archbishop in that area, who insist, the Bishop of Pemba and the Archbishop of Nampula insist that the insurgency has nothing to do with religion. And the bishop, in fact, issued a statement the day that a church was bombed, saying exactly that this is not about religion, that there are other factors involved. And the other factors include, as in northern Nigeria, as in Iraq, in Mosul, when ISIS took over that city, for example. It includes government marginalization of these areas, socioeconomic problems, people seeing the resources. There's a suspicion that northern Mozambique is going to have the largest, or has the largest gas reserves in the world. And the people in that region will not benefit from it. Corruption, army atrocities, etc. And of course, the biggest exploiter of the gas there is Total, of which almost 40% is American owned. And so here, right next door to my country, we're seeing the Islamophobia and war on terror discourses merging right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that insight. We will return to some of the important points you raised in the question and answer session. For right now, let me give the floor to Professor Sami. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Üveys, and thank you for my co-panelists for their contributions and their remarks. This lecture is about the issue of terrorism that Professor Mousavi introduced us to several definitions. Some of these definitions are classic. He said there is not a universal definition. And then he mentioned the FBI definition, which is very interesting, because if you look closely at the FBI definition of this T word, the very loaded word, you'll find it doesn't say anything about state sponsored, even though it talks about international and domestic, but in its definition, when you try to unpack it, it says violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups who are inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations. In other words, they are the ones who would define what acts, what groups, what individuals are going to be called terrorists. And this is not anything about any state doing any kinds of a violent act against civilians. And of course, here it doesn't even talk about civilians. So this is a very restricted definition that will help it in trying to prosecute. And in the previous panel, we saw, hundreds and hundreds of cases that were prosecuted, innocent people who have absolutely nothing to do with terrorism, and yet they were charged under several laws associated with terrorism. I mean, it reminds me of the Arab verse as part of a poem, قتل امرئ في غابة جريمة لا تغتفر وقتل شعب آمن مسألة فيها نظر, which roughly translates as killing a person in a forest is an unforgivable crime, but the killing of people living in safety is a matter that ought to be considered. As both of my colleagues have pointed out, the T word is a very loaded word, and it's being used selectively and more importantly, politically and geopolitically. It is meant to isolate, to marginalize, to disregard, sideline, dismiss, banish, put people in a situation where they are always on the defensive. It means in the psyche, in the background, we're talking about people who are violent, inferior, barbarian, fanatic, radical, fundamentalist, backward, extremist, ignorant, uncivilized, you name it. It's all these words combined, and it's intended for that. And my talk today is in the context of the Palestinian struggle. While we try to strip it to its basics, we find that what we are faced with for the past, I'm talking about the Palestinians, for the past 100 years or even more than 100 years is an onslaught by a political movement with particular aims, with particular goals, in order to dispossess certain people and bring others in their place. And with that, to use whatever means at its disposal, including all violent means that fit the description and the definition of terrorism, in order to achieve its goals and fulfill its aims. We're talking about, of course, the Zionist movement and its Israeli settler project, that is to bring Palestine under the control, effective control of the Zionist movement. And before I move on, I just want to make sure that people understand that there is a huge difference between Zionism and Judaism. This audience surely will know this. There is no need for me to remind them. But since this is a talk and presentation that would be heard by many others, it's very important to make that distinction. And here I take people to the definition of anti-Semitism, the definition on anti-Semitism by the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was signed by over 200 Jewish professors, even though I have some issues because of its focus on Israel. Nevertheless, it gives a good definition that when people criticize the Israeli state or criticize the Zionist movement or even take issue, this is not anti-Jewish, but this is the way to, the anti-Semitism label is used as a way to disregard any kind of argument in order to avoid talking about the real issue. And the real issue here is what is the Zionist movement? What is the aim of the Zionist movement? What does the historical record tell us about the Zionist movement and its project, which is the establishment of a settler colonialist state in the land of Palestine? That is the essence of my talk. And my thesis is very simple, that Israel was built on terrorism during all its time, before it was created, when it was created, after it was created, and continue to be the case. Israel is a terrorist state that was founded in terrorism, sustained on terrorism, subsisted and continued on the use of terrorism, and its leaders and benefactors believe that it could only survive on its ability to use unlimited and overwhelming force against those that it robbed, stole their land, killed, exiled, maligned, banished, and so on and so forth. Israel is considered by the Zionist movement as its fulfillment of that dream, of that project, of that embodiment. And when we try to look at Zionism, we'll find that we are before a racist political ideology that believes simply in Jewish supremacy. I'm not making this up. Every piece of information that I will provide in this presentation is backed up by evidence. It has an overwhelming amount of evidence, not only by those who have a bone to pick with Israel, but even those who consider themselves Israelis and what is called the Israeli historians, people like Ilan Pape, Tom Segev, even Benny Morris, Thomas Suarez, who wrote a whole book about the state of terrorism and how the state was created through these acts of terrorism. So when we talk about the story of Israel, we're talking about the story of the Zionist movement. They are both embedded together. When Zionism was established towards the end of the 19th century and started marching towards fulfilling its goals, it has many goals, but there are three in particular that it has embraced in order to define its presence, its existence. The first is to bring all Jews from around the world under its effective control. It has, in doing this, it had to redefine Judaism from being a religion and faith into simply a race. One of the founders of the state, David Ben-Gurion, said that the Jewish state was not based on Judaism, was not based on the Jewish faith, but based on being a Jew. In other words, he is using a racial definition of what a Jew is. It's not what you believe in, it's just what you're born with. And of course, there's a huge distinction, and that's why Zionism is a problem. It does not, even though it doesn't define itself in religious terms, but it defines itself in racial and nationalistic terms, which makes it very, very dangerous, not just for those that it is trying to rob and trying to exile and banish, but even to the Jews themselves, to those who adhere to the religion of Judaism. It wants to represent them regardless, simply because of who were they born as. And of course, as I said, by redefining this Jewish religion, it's trying to hijack it for political interests and colonial aims. It defines its project basically as a settler colonialist project in the same tradition of all imperialist powers, based on religious myths, in this case, historical fairy tales and fantasies, using that religious affiliation as the hook so that it can define its own population. In order to achieve this, of course, it had another goal, which is the exile and banishment and exclusion of the indigenous Palestinian people, because to bring millions of people into the land of Palestine, while the land of Palestine already has its own people, you have to empty it. You have to make room for these. And since your ideology is an exclusivist ideology that does not recognize the other, does not intend to live together even as co-equals or even coexistence. So from its very beginning, the Zionist movement was had very much a program where it's going to depopulate Palestine. The way to do this first is to come through other powers. In this case, it was Britain. And of course, I'm not going to give all the history of this because of the time limitation. But of course, it came through with that in mind by building militias. The moment the Zionists were able to establish presence in Palestine through the British mandate by bringing thousands and thousands of Jews from particularly Europe, both east and side, from Poland, Russia, Germany, England, all kinds of different Jewish communities in Europe. And of course, they used all kinds of tactics in order to bring these immigrants, a lot of them were called displaced persons because of what was happening in Europe, because of the racism of Europe, because of what the Germans and others did to their own Jews. And of course, that was in the interest of the Zionist movement. There is a lot of literature, how Zionism allied themselves at one point or another with fascist forces in Italy, including Mussolini, and also with the Nazis, because they had the same aim, which is to take the Jews of Europe and resettle them in Palestine so that they can build their state. But of course, that wasn't enough, because Palestine did have its own people who lived there for thousands of years. My family from my mother's side has been there for over 1400 years, from the first days of the Islamic calendar. At any rate, for them to realize this, they had to resort to extraordinary measures, using extreme violence and ruthless terror. Because how else are you going to force the Palestinians to leave so that they can make room to your own project? And there are plenty of literature, including the memoirs of those who are called the founders of the state, of this settler state, in which they talk about this very openly, whether it was Ben-Gurion, Begin, Shamir, Jabotinsky, all these leaders who were leading this early colonization of Palestine. They said this very openly, Chaim Weizmann and others, that we have to empty, we have to create a situation where the Palestinians have to be deported, have to leave, have to make room. And so from the late 1920s till the declaration of the state on March 14, 1948, all these paramilitary groups were set up. The Haganah, which was part of the Jewish agency, that was basically the de facto government of the Jewish communities in Palestine, who came through this illegal acts of immigration under the power of the British, who gave them this so-called Balfour Declaration. And of course, these imperialist powers, first Britain and then the United States, they had their own goals of why they're trying to create Israel in the midst of the Arab and Muslim world at the time where the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. And of course, we've seen now, what Biden was saying almost 30 years ago, when he said, if there wasn't an Israel, we as the United States would have invented Israel, because he was thinking of these geopolitical goals that this Zionist settler colonial state would give to these great powers. Ergon Zevai Leumi, this terrorist organization that was established also for the sole purpose of terrorizing the Palestinian communities so that they can leave Palestine. This started, as I said, from the late 20s and continued for almost 20 years uninterrupted. The Zionists themselves defined their enemies as three. And believe it or not, the Arabs and Palestinians came as number three. Much of that terror that established the state was really targeting not only Palestinians and Arabs in order to populate them, but anyone who would stand would stand against this program. So non-Zionist Jews were also targets. They killed hundreds of Jews simply because they did not go along with their own plans. The so-called democracies who called for the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter basically says that peoples have, comes out of the 14th point of President Wilson, that people have the right to self-determination. So anybody who called for non-Jewish entities to have self-determination and oppose Zionism immediately became target. the famous case of Lord Moyne, who was obviously killed, and Count Bernadotte, who was also assassinated by these groups because they stood, or they thought to have stood, against the plans of the Zionists. So when you go and examine on a daily basis from the 1920s all up to 1948, you will find that there was a campaign of terror that went through Palestine. This is, much of that is, even though it is known, not much of that is no one's talking about. These people would target public squares with bombs, cinemas, theaters, vegetable markets. And by the way, when I once asked my grandmother when was my mother born, because there was a dispute whether she was born in a particular date in the end of February or the beginning of March, her answer to me was very simple. She said, when there was a bomb in the vegetable market, this when she was born. So even my mother was born at the time when there was a bomb in the vegetable market, where it was visited by hundreds of people, women, children, old men, civilians. And this was something that would take place on a recurring basis, that when people go there, they would have to take precautions, because at any point in time, there will be packages where will be bombs, crowded places, including playgrounds, telephone kiosks, telegraph posts, newspaper stands, printing shops, coffee houses, street corners, train stations, post offices, public buildings, bridges, buses, police stations, gas stations, oil pipelines, airports, hijacking planes or skyjacking, killing. This was going on a continuous basis. When you go and even check the British archives, you will find that they have, within let's say a couple of weeks, more than 30 incidents of this kind of operations. And the whole purpose of this was to depopulate Palestine, to make sure that they will create a terror, so that the people would have no recourse or no way but to leave Palestine, but to be forced for exile.
Dr. Sami, you have 5 minutes.
Oh my God. All right, I'm gonna skip a lot. I was gonna, there were hundreds of massacres, and I mean the data is beyond, including new massacres, all kinds of terrorist operations. If you have to consider whether it was killing prisoners of war, whether it was assassinations, there is a book that was called Rise and Kill First. The author in that book, I believe we counted at least 850 assassinations that targeted scholars, scientists, poets, authors, leaders, civilians, even by sometimes they would kill people who work in restaurants and so on and so forth. I mean, we're talking about a deliberate state policy. Even assassinations are supposed to be against international law, but this is an official policy. And recently you've seen also a lot. We even talked about the siege and so on and so forth. So that's I think that is well established. That we are talking about a state that was established, created, sustained, and survived on the use of terror. And yet, it is the Palestinians who are being labeled as terrorists simply because they are resisting. And there lies the irony, is because international law actually gives the Palestinians all rights in order to defend themselves. I mean, I don't even have time to cite all the different resolutions and international law, but it's well given in that. I wrote a study and an article about this, which details all the different laws. However, even with that, the Palestinians have opted now for the most part is to resist. We have seen the Great March of Return. Granted that this is about the balance of power, but the Palestinians are insisting. That's why the Zionists, even with all the power that they have amassed and all the support they got from the United States and other international powers, they are unable to end the resistance and the steadfastness and the determination and the will of the Palestinian people in order to regain back their rights. So with that, I want to conclude by saying that the Palestinians are not going anywhere, which is a testament to the failure of the Zionist project, because the whole notion of the Zionist project is, number one, to bring the Jews of the world, and they failed because even the number of Jews in the settler state in Palestine today are perhaps not more than 50 or 60% of the Jews of the world, after even 100 years of trying to intimidate and bring them in. And number two, the Palestinians, about half of the Palestinians still are in Palestine, and the other half are longing to go back. So they haven't forgotten. And the gamble was that, okay, we're going to get them out, and somehow they're going to forget about it, while you'll find that almost 70% of the exiled Palestinians are living around Palestine, still dreaming for the time that they go back. So how do we end this? You know, I think, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to go over all the justification and the reasons. I have that in different forums that I talked about. That is that as long as Palestinians exist, and as long as we have a support for this just struggle throughout the world, that means the struggle continues, regardless of what's happening today on the ground. And as long as the struggle continues, that means that there will always be this struggle that would have to end by either side, you know, either the Palestinians able to restore back or to regain back their rights, or the Israelis would have to rule over them all the time in a system that would resemble the apartheid state system, which I think over time would be unsustainable. And we have seen the tremendous change that have taken place even among Jewish communities, particularly in the United States and Europe, where this kind of things cannot be sustained. And that would give me the hope that we are able to build worldwide solidarity movement that will weaken the foundations. And I've outlined 12 imperatives that sustain the state of Israel, and in a different paper also, in which when people deal with that, eventually that system cannot be sustained, cannot stay. And when we end the Zionist nature of the state, when it collapses, then we are going to get to see the final solution of this thing. This is not about the final solution that Hitler was saying, the end of Judaism. In fact, we will save Judaism from Zionism because of what Zionism is doing to Judaism by altering its definition from being a great religion into a race. And that's where I think is going to be the future. And that's where terrorism would finally be defeated, because terrorism as a tool in order to subjugate one people over the other would be defeated, where the true justice in Palestine would take place. Let me stop here, and if there are any questions, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami. I will use my position as a moderator to ask a few questions, and then I will also forward some of the questions that we've received online. First and foremost, I want to thank all of the participants and for their insightful comments. Let me begin by kind of trying to tie together some of the things that were in common in the three presentations. And then I will touch on some points that need further elaboration. So one thing that I see in common is that the word terror or terrorists is a quite fluid term, right? So there isn't a very specific definition. And also, I think all three of the participants highlighted the fact that modern nation states use this term for pragmatic purposes. But I saw that there was a disagreement about whether or not that term is something that
Is it just me?
No, Üveys is frozen.
Oh, okay.
I apologize. I think I got cut out.
Mm.
My question was so Dr. Sami's last presentation tried to expand the definition of the term to include state-sponsored terrorism, and it seemed that Professor Hamid and Mr. Naeem had both said that this term isn't really useful because it serves more in terms of myth making than it does actually point to a real entity. So one basic question is that what do we do with this term? Do we try to expand its definition, or do we try to pinpoint the failures of the term and try to disable the term on behalf of nation states? So this is for the panel in general. I would start with Professor Hamid, because you began with kind of putting a definition on the table.
I do think that a definition could be useful. Nevertheless, I think it's very important to analyze who gets to interpret and who gets to categorize the definition. And we can get a lot of insights from critical security studies, which actually studies how certain events and certain terms are securitized. And most often this is done by people in power. So if we're talking in terms of domestic politics, it would be the government in each country. And if we're talking about international politics, then it would be right now largely the United States, which is able to, create a narrative and make it so powerful where it gets to decide what is terrorism and what is not, and who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist. So I think there's no escaping having definitions, but at the same time, we have to understand the power relations behind how the term is used and utilized, I think.
Dr. Sami?
Well, I believe that the term, we can't do away with it. I mean, it's part of life. And I don't think doing away with it is a useful thing, because if people get terrorized, you need a description of that. Of course, as Hamid says, that we need to have a definition that suits the situation. And in this case, the FBI definition was so narrow, so it will never include Israel, because it doesn't talk about state-sponsored terrorism, even in the international context. So Israel here is basically getting a free card. It could use whatever it wants to get away with it, including everything that is done in the past and doing now in the future. But when we try to describe what's happening to the population in Palestine using their own definition, you will find that the Palestinians have been living in terror throughout this past century. And therefore, it's very important that we expand that definition so that people understand who the terrorist really is. I don't think it's useful for us to do away with it so that no one knows actually what that is. State violence, state-sponsored terrorism are facts of life, and they have to be expanded, including, by the way, what the US is doing. I mean, by its own definition, the US has been involved in state violence throughout its international campaigns. I mean, back, I believe it was Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, I think was maybe 95 or so, when they authorized $400 million to attack Iran through supporting groups that were engaged in violence against the state. I mean, this is their own definition, where you have groups attacking installations, attacking civilians, attacking this. So it was financing basically terrorism, but it did not define them as such. So I believe that all in all, we have to have a definition that is going to be descriptive of what's happening on the ground. And at the same time, we have a very well-known definition of what resistance is and the tools by which it has been recognized in international law, including particularly to that struggle, Palestinian struggle. There are many resolutions by the United Nations that recognize the Palestinian struggle, including the use of armed struggle against the Israeli military. So that is not even in dispute.
Mr. Naeem, would you like to add something?
Sure. No, doing away with the term is not helpful, I think, as both the other speakers have said. It is a reality. There is such a thing called terrorism, as Dr. Sami spoke about in detail in his presentation. It does exist. But I think, like many other things, many other kinds of terminology that have been appropriated by those in power, it needs to be problematized. So there's a whole discipline called critical terrorism studies. And our speaker yesterday in the first panel, Marie Breen Smythe, is one of the kind of leading theorists in critical terrorism studies, that looks at the notion of terrorism from a different kind of perspective, includes state terrorism within that, looks at interrogating causes for which people adopt terrorist tactics, etc. And so it's a term and a phenomenon that does exist, but it needs to be stripped of the ideological baggage that it has in order to make it something that is useful. Because at the moment, it's not useful because it serves particular kind of ideologies of power.
Is there any hope that there may be a kind of a UN or international level definitional term that could be put in circulation as a way of trying to disarm the term from its ideological uses? I mean, we have terms, that technical legal terms for other sectors of life. Is there any hope that that could happen, where we could begin to take more hold from a more objective position?
I don't think there's hope that that would happen, and I don't think that that is desirable. I don't think it's desirable to find a legal definition for the word terrorism. It exists in a political sense, ethical sense, etc., but legal definition will become very problematic. And so to date, the UN does not have a proper legal definition for terrorism. In the academic literature, you're looking at, Hamid will be able to tell us, but something like more than 220 definitions of what it might be. And I think that that's a good place to be. Let's have 220 definitions and argue it, but not make a legal definition out of it, because that'll become problematic.
But that wouldn't that make it difficult for us to make the case that, for instance, state-sponsored terrorism is actually, for instance, the Palestinian case, or say the Kashmiri case or something like that, where you have state-sponsored acts of violence against innocent populations. In that case, it seems like it might be advantageous to have the word terrorism, have some kind of court of appeal, a legal recourse for those kind of violations. Or do you think we already have vocabulary enough to address those kinds of situations, and we need not engage the terrorism discourse?
I'm sure Hamid will want to jump in here, but my view is that the crimes against humanity committed in Kashmir and in Palestine, there are legal instruments for that. Whether you're talking about apartheid, whether you're talking about various kinds of crimes of genocide, whatever the case might be, there are legal instruments. To create a new one is not necessarily going to be helpful, and I think that we should leave terrorism as a political concept rather than a legal concept. And from that perspective, it can be useful. And we can make the argument, of course, that Dr. Sami has made about states that practice terrorism. And again, we should be clear that terrorism is not an ideology. Terrorism is a tactic. And in some cases, liberation movements have used terrorism as a tactic. I'm working on an article now on the South African struggle against apartheid, where there was a whole debate in the 50s about should we use terrorism as a tactic or not. It was one of the legitimate options that was available.
If I may jump here, I think I want to echo that. You know, the notion of genocide, the notion of ethnic cleansing, crime against humanity, all these have already been defined, and there is an agreement, international agreement on what they mean, because they have particular meanings legally as well as on the ground. When it comes to terrorism, you know, when the United States designates certain group as terrorism, as terrorist, obviously there is a whole political idea behind it. There's a whole political agenda behind it. So there is no way that you're going to have an agreement throughout the world that this group is particularly terrorist or not, even though people could define certain acts by certain groups as being terrorist. So I think I would agree that terrorism should not be a legal term. And that's why it's so problematic when you have all these laws in different countries, particularly in the United States, that tries to define what terrorism is, where it really has absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. Because now in the US, the law is, if you give a charity to a group that is designated because of political reasons, and by that I mean not even charity, advice. If today on the books, if the United States wants to prosecute someone because he tells Hamas publicly that you're not supposed to use terrorism, I advise you to use peaceful means. That's an advice. That is part of material support. You could go to 30 years just by giving them the advice not to use violence. So it's all used for, and we've seen it. I mean, we've seen in this conference, as well as we're going to see in other presentations, how these laws are being manipulated. So I would rather have this outside the realm of the law, but in the realm of descriptive. And I've said, when you go, it's been used against Arabs and Muslims because there is a political agenda here. They want to marginalize. You are the terrorists, you are the fanatics, you are the radicals, you are the extremists, you are, and this and that. While we have to take it back to its original meaning linguistically. What does it mean when you try to terrorize whole populations, whole peoples, in order to get a political agenda? So when you do it against an Israeli, and you say this is terrorism, but when they do it against a whole population in Gaza, this is legitimate because Israel has the right to defend itself. I mean, this is the problem with the use of the word, which I think needs to be corrected through massive education and solidarity movements.
Thank you very much. One of the things that was very clear to me was that this word terrorism and the war on terror in general disproportionately affects Muslim populations. But one of the things that I couldn't understand, and maybe you as the panelist, maybe you can shed light on, is for what geostrategic interests are Muslims particularly targeted with this vocabulary? Because, as you know, there's no great power in the possession of Muslims that could challenge or rival, the international order or even America. So my question is, for what geostrategic reasons are Muslims, whether in the form of Arabs or Uyghurs or Kashmiris or whatever have you, why are they disproportionately the target of this vocabulary? How does it serve anybody? I mean, it doesn't seem like there's not a lot of what do you call it, like a profit, geostrategic profit that one can gain from this, as opposed to, for instance, using this vocabulary against China or like Chinese people or like or like Russians or something. You see what I mean?
It's very useful. I mean, if I may, it's very useful for Israelis to go and change the subject. This is not about dispossessing people. This is not about colonizing their land. It's not about robbing them. This is not about banishing them and exiling them and not allowing them to return back. This is about them being terrorists. And if you're a terrorist, you really have no place on the table. And that's why Yasser Arafat had to go and apologize and denounce and say that and recognize so that he can have a place at the table. And at the end, what happened is that he got nothing. And he died knowing that he's been tricked. And that's what's happening also to the current Palestinian leadership, that they have been stripped of their right to resist that occupation by basically succumbing to every dictate that they gave to them by simply branding them as terrorists. And people don't have time to go and try to examine the historical record. And that's why people don't get their rights until they absolutely insist. And I think the best example of this is the Taliban.
If I may also talk about that, Üveys, I would actually disagree with what you're saying. I think the United States has very real important interests in the Middle East. I mean, Since the early 50s, when they became involved in the Middle East, they understood that this is a very geostrategic area of the globe. First of all, it's a major resource hub. I mean, both in terms of oil as well as gas. Also, it's a main area of rivalry with other powers during the Cold War with the Soviet Union and now with Russia and China. One example that we just saw today is that Iran signed a 25-year agreement with China, and the Americans don't like this. So even if we put Israel aside, the Americans have very real interests in the region. Now, when you bring Israel into the mix, then there's a whole set of new, dynamics going on. And as I was saying, if you look at Hollywood films, they were directly affected by the wars between Israel and the Arabs. So after each war, you would see Hollywood films demonizing Arabs. So Israel again plays into the mix. Now with Russia and China, you also have demonization of those countries in the United States. I mean, if you look at the Gallup polls, Americans don't view China and Russia positively. It's only done a bit differently. So with Muslims and Arabs, you have the terrorism label. With those countries, you have other issues such as, meddling in US elections, unfair trade deals, etc., etc. So you do have the same demonization, and I do think that they actually serve a very specific purpose. So the American media is doing this very deliberately, and it is serving very real interests.
I think Üveys, from Dr. Sami and Hamid's comments, it's clear that on a national level, of course, it's very easy to make the argument about why the terrorist notion is useful. Whether you talk about Palestine or talk about Egypt, for example, on a national level, it's very easy to make that in order to crush dissent, etc. But your question is also on a global scale. What does the US get out of demonizing Muslims in general in this kind of way? And I think it's an important question beyond just the national and even beyond the regional. Hamid pointed out to why the Middle East and North Africa region might be important to the US and to others. It's not just the US, of course. I mean, look at Russia's role in the region now and in the whole of Africa as well. And also their use of the term terrorism. So yes, but the other thing is that, two other things. One is that it's also a useful description that can change. So at some point, Saddam Hussein was the guy who was fighting the terrorists. And then at another point, he became the guy who was the terrorist himself. So it's just a useful thing in order to use to demonize people. But on the global level, one issue that we mustn't ignore is that there's also a civilizational and cultural aspect to this. Now, we're not just talking about Palestinians, we're not just talking about Iranians and Hezbollah and those kinds of things. Does ISIS, for example, or did ISIS, let's say 5, 7, 8 years ago, pose a threat to the United States? No, it did not pose a threat to the United States directly in terms of its territory. ISIS had no intention to launch a war in the United States or in Europe. Its attacks there only took place after it was attacked by them, etc. But what it does pose is a civilizational kind of challenge and a cultural challenge. The idea that there can be, and I'm trying to be careful in how I choose my words here because I don't want to come across as an ISIS supporter, clearly. But the notion that there can be a challenge to the colonial structures that have been put in place. that, that this whole edifice that has been created over the past century, over the past few centuries, can be challenged by people who come from the global south, from the subaltern, etc. That is a kind of challenge that ISIS did pose. And so if you allow this kind of challenge to continue, and ISIS here, you know, another little thing there, whether it's in the extreme violent way that ISIS did it, or in an academic way somewhere else, that challenge is much more than oil and gas in one country. It's a much more substantial and substantive challenge. And I think that that being able to demonize Muslims across the board, if you think that from among these Muslims, they might, there's a possibility of these kinds of challenges arising, can be very useful. So why does, you know, as Asim Qureshi said in the earlier panel, why did the US basically assist China in creating the terrorist label for the Uyghurs? The Uyghurs are these poor guys in China that have no impact on the US whatsoever. Because if you allow that, and you allow the solidarity for that, and you allow a global kind of Muslim solidarity for that, even though it's against China, there's the possibility that it'll go beyond that. And this kind of solidarity will become more than just about targeting one country.
And of course, there is also a geopolitical aspect to this. The post-World War II system was created by the United States, and it has an interest in maintaining it as being basically the superior power around the globe, with other great powers, that it has its own competition, but yet the United States is the foremost power. And any kind of label that could be given to certain groups, certain states, certain regions, certain people, certain cultures that could alter this power structure is very useful. And particularly when in physical terms, they are less powerful. So it's part of the soft power tactics that is used, is how to marginalize communities and marginalize movements and so on and so forth. And this is very useful also when you have client states. You know, these client states, especially if they're authoritarian, that you're going to marginalize certain parts of the population, so the structures don't change. So you have all these labels ready to be used in order to marginalize or disenfranchise all kinds of movements, all kinds of people, all kinds of parties, authoritarian, undemocratic, terrorist, fanatic, fundamentalist, and so on and so forth. But I think what we need, the question I think that you're trying to get at is, how do we change this? I mean, should we live with it? And I think that's where we have the think tanks and research centers and academics and intellectuals to come together and try to think outside the box, is how we deal with these phenomena. Because these are political phenomena for geopolitical reasons and agendas, and they're being used and utilized. And there are real lives who are being sacrificed because of these kind of actions. And I think it has to go also with the overall structure of the world. You know, and talk about, you know, social justice issues, human rights issues, civil rights issues, and so on and so forth. It's all part of that agenda. It's both domestic and international. I mean, the use of terrorism now is going to be used also in the United States to demonize all kinds of different people. I mean, we saw Trump trying to, the Antifa movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, trying to give them that label. It didn't work, but who knows that they, in the future, they may actually be demonized to the point where whole struggle for civil rights, for equal rights, for social justice could also be used under this label in order to undermine this whole cause.
May I, Üveys, is it okay if I just?
Yeah, sure. We're in free mode here.
Okay, thank you. So while I completely agree with Dr. Sami and me, I mean, all of the panelists here, I know we're all very critical of the American approach to the issue of terrorism, and of course the Israeli approach. But at the same time, I would like to also open a new chapter and say that I think we have to acknowledge at the same time that we do have an extremism and terrorism problem in the Muslim world. So it's not just, you know, American or Zionist demonization. I mean, as a practicing Muslim myself, sometimes when I see what, you know, groups like ISIS do or Boko Haram does, I mean, I'm truly terrified, and I think that they are very, very far from the way and the sunnah of the Prophet. And I think, you know, I was reading in Western media, I don't know if these numbers are accurate, I'm not an expert on this issue, but I was reading that over 8,000 people had joined ISIS from Western countries, many of them Muslim converts. And on this issue, I think we as Muslims we're good at denouncing, you know, things that ISIS does or Boko Haram does, but I think we're not really successful at looking at the ideological roots of where these, you know, where does this kind of mentality come from? You know, sometimes when I read the tweets of some, you know, activists such as, I mean, I don't know if I should name them or not, but somebody like, say, Muhammad Al-Arifi, who had 20 million Twitter followers after Twitter, you know, closed his account. He reopened a new one. I don't know how many millions he has now, but you do see that kind of extremism being fed to a lot of youngsters. And the result of that is violence against Muslims primarily, because we all know that ISIS killed many, many, many more Muslims than it did Westerners. You know, they did terrorist operations in France, etc., but they killed much, much more people in Iraq and in Syria and all that. And we're not very good at looking where do these kinds of ideologies come from, and why are we not successful at fighting these kinds of ideologies? And I think if we're not successful at doing that, then we're never going to win the war of the narrative, you know, and this is going to affect issues such as the Palestinian struggle as well. You know, in our minds, these issues might be separated, but from the Western perspective, you know, someone who's living in the United States, I always tell my wife that if I was born in the United States as a Christian, then I would probably have a very negative view of Islam and Muslims. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, you look at the media, you look at what's happening, and we're not very good at, you know, fighting this. Just to open up the discussion.
That's a very interesting point, Professor Hamid. There's something there that I think that kind of coincides with what Mr. Naeem was saying earlier, which was that even the Archbishop in his case that he was highlighting, the Mozambique case, was very clear that this is not a religious issue. So my question is a little bit more abstract, but bear with me. Is there a real ideological problem on the table? Or do we have real problems of, for instance, poor governance, lack of resources, poverty, lack of autonomy, self-determination? I mean, I don't mean it could be both, but it seems like in the Mozambique case, but also the argument could also be made of somewhere like Syria, where, I mean, groups like ISIS emerged, where we had unprofessional militias running around doing all kinds of things. You know, sometimes they're talking in terms of Islam, sometimes they're talking in terms of post-colonial theory. We don't know what exactly is going on there, but what I'm trying to say is that is the real cause of that ideology, or do you think that the cause of it is more grounded in empirical facts, such as, you know, the ones that I had listed?
If I may, there are two levels here at work, and I think in our presentation maybe we were focused more on the relationship with the West and how it's been manipulated. But I do acknowledge, of course, that we do have problem within the Muslim world, and that's the other level that we will focus on it possibly in other sessions, and we don't have the time to go over it. But indeed, we do have a problem, but it's much more nuanced and it's much deeper than simply ideology. I mean, certainly the West has been manipulating these groups as well, because it's trying to make a point. And I could argue also that Israel has been also an ally to some of these groups in certain areas in the region, and because it has an interest into making sure that there are a civil war within Muslim countries. And therefore, foreign agents or foreign countries would like to see this as being a trend, as being something. So if there are some groups who are extremist or who are ideologically inclined to start some sort of a civil war within Islam, as long as it is controlled, they will help them. I mean, we've seen what they were doing, before that was on nationalism, Iraq and Iran for 8 years. They were basically supporting both sides in order to make sure that that war will continue, because it's a war of attrition. Similarly, what's happening in Syria, it was left there as a low warfare in order to bring this to the fore. That solidifies the point that Israel, in order for it to be the hegemon in the region, all other forces have to be weakened. And if that means that we're going to start civil wars, be it. I mean, Israel was a major actor in the Lebanese civil war. And we see, it was a major actor in trying to split Sudan into South and North. It's playing different, roles in Iraqi Kurdistan in order to split Iraq Kurdistan. It's part of the overall plan of the Zionist movement that for Israel to become the most powerful country in the region, all others have to be very weak, combined. Even when you combine them all, they will still be weaker than Israel. So part of that mosaic, part of that strategy is to start these kind of wars. But do we have a problem within? Yes, of course we do. I mean, and part of it has to do with repression and tyranny, is because when you do not have democratic values and democratic systems where people could debate without fear and without having to resort to violence, then obviously the bad apples will fall down and the good ones will rise up. But when you have this tyranny and repression throughout the region, and we saw what happened after the Arab Spring movements, when people tried to revolt, and this was counter-revolution to bring them down, it was basically a war against Islam, then you had to see all kinds of movements that have basically misinterpreted for the most part, and they try, and some of them were even supported by others in order to rise them to make that is the face of Islam.
Üveys, I could say it's both, but I think I need to explain that it's both ideological and the conditions on the ground. I say I need to explain that because in many of these cases, the kind of ideological underpinnings were there. And in many societies, there are forms of extremist thought. But does extremist thought go beyond that into taking over territory and killing people that are not your religion, etc.? That kind of transition is often assisted by the material conditions. Now, if we look at Mosul, why did such a large part of Mosul, in a sense, actually welcome ISIS initially? Thousands of Iraqi soldiers ran with their tails between their legs in the face of a few hundred ISIS fighters. Why? Because they received particular kinds of support from that city. Why? Because Mosul, people in Mosul felt that they were marginalized by the central state. If we look at northern Mozambique, now it's this well, let me just call it for purposes of this discussion, this Muslim insurgency. But 30 years ago, there was an insurgency that was based in the north. It was Renamo, which was funded by the South African apartheid government and the United States against the Marxist Frelimo government based in Maputo. Why did people in that area support Renamo? Because they were marginalized. They were not given the resources that the South was given. Now it's become even worse because they are seeing the resources right in front of them. The Total installations, gas installations, are there for them to see, and they're not getting any benefit out of it. And when they try to make a noise, they get crushed. So these groups, the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in northern Mozambique, the elements of that group has been there for years as little study groups in different masajid. They had what we might regard, we modernists perhaps might regard as extremist thought, whatever, it was there, nothing came of it. But when people began to feel that they were being disadvantaged, when people began to feel that they needed something to assist them against this oppression that they were facing, well, then this came to the fore. the majority of people there are Muslims. It was easy for this. And before, you know, the most serious of these violent actions took place, many of the community members in northern Mozambique actually felt that they were better off under Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah rule than under the Mozambican army because of the atrocities that army committed. It's documented by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc. And so the material conditions feed into how the ideology translates into something that is implemented as a program. You see that all over the place. What that program becomes, of course, then is dependent on how that ideology looks before. Now, Dr. Sami said earlier on, you know, the responses to these things need to be both global and domestic. And I think that talking about global responses, you know, that's what we're doing, Dr. Sami, I guess, in this conference. But let me give you an example of a domestic response, which of course needs to be adaptable and adapted, or not adapted, needs to be indigenous from different contexts. My argument in the South African context, for example, is that if you want to stem the recruitment of ISIS in South Africa, stop talking about de-radicalization. I'm not suggesting that South African authorities do, but that is the kind of thing that the Americans and Europeans are trying to bring in, the, you know, de-radicalization. And of course, they have programs ready for governments like South Africa to adopt. Stop talking about de-radicalization. If you want to stem the flow of South Africans to ISIS, then we need a program of re-radicalization. We need a program where South African Muslim youth are encouraged to get involved politically, to express their anger politically within our context, whether they join opposition parties, whether they join groups like Fees Must Fall, etc. However militant or not they might be, however political or not they might be, they have a role to play. They have a strong political sense. They want an outlet for it. They believe that that political sense, many of them, comes from their Islam. Well, there is an outlet. We have in South Africa a party called Al-Jama'ah, which is a Muslim party. You know, many of us, when it was formed, thought this was some kind of an oddity and laughed at it. Just 2 years ago, when in the city where I'm from, Johannesburg, when there was the opposition, the national opposition party was ruling the city and was getting thrown out, all the other parties, including the national ruling party, the ANC, one of the proposals for who should be the mayor was this guy from Al-Jama'ah, one member of that party, but they thought he was useful, okay, to play that role. Now, what I'm saying is that here's an example of young people that can play a role politically. We need to re-radicalize Muslim youth to understand what politics and social responsibility means in Islam, to be able to play a proper role in the societies where they come from. And this is what prevents the transition into ideological and physical extremism.
Thank you very much. We have now come to the end of our time together. I would like to give you one more opportunity to say any closing remarks, if there was something that you wanted to respond to that happened over the course of the discussion. And with that, we'll close the session. Professor Sami, Professor
Not
Hamid.
from me, Üveys. I've said whatever I wanted to say. Thank you.
Hamid, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. If I want to conclude what I was trying to say, I think if we really want to change the world we're living in the conditions of Muslims, we have to fight extremism at home among the Muslim Ummah. And when I say fight, I don't mean fight with bullets or machine guns, but I do think that there are ideological pinnings to a lot of the extremism in the Muslim world. I mean, if you read, I had a student who was studying the recruitment material for ISIS, and we read a lot of it together. And if you read a lot of it, there is a lot of Quran and Hadith and Sunnah in it. So it on the surface, it actually seems convincing. So there needs to be a lot of scholarship by Muslim imams to fight this kind of extremism and hopefully to get rid of it. At the same time, on the other level of, having Western governments such as the United States utilizing these definitions against the Muslim world, I think at the same time, we Muslims are very weak in terms of convincing other people of our viewpoints. I mean, we're not very active in terms of arts. I mean, movie making. We have to remember that, slavery in the United States, people started to become against it using a single novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's how much, the arts, whether it's writing or films or series and all that, can have an effect. We in the Muslim world, we don't really value these issues. I'll give you an example. The Iranian Foreign Ministry, the spokesperson, all of his press conferences are in Farsi. When you tell them why are the press conferences are in Farsi, they tell you, well, it's because the official language of the country. But that's not very convincing, because if you're trying to talk to other people, the very basic idea you have to be able to communicate with them. And I find this in a lot of Muslim countries, that we don't really value the issue of trying to put across our viewpoints towards other people, whether they're Americans or Europeans. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in the Muslim Ummah in that regard. And I want to thank my panelists and Üveys as well. Thank you.
Very well. I agree that we do have a problem of extremism within the Islamic world, and that there are a lot of problems with many groups, both in ideological understanding, on the interpretation of religion, of the Quran, and so on and so forth. I acknowledge that, and we are part. I have been part of that conversation. I have fought many of these trends and many of these ideologies, even when I was in the United States, when I was seeing what's happening in Afghanistan and the type of extremist ideology that some people embraced, which does not adhere to the teachings as I know them. And I think there has been a lot of people within the Islamic world, and talking about groups and scholars and so on and so forth, who have been fighting this. My problem, of course, is that the great powers, Western powers, and other regional actors, they don't care about this. They are very much willing to use these actors for their own ends. So one day they are their friends and they give them, and that second day they are being used so that they can keep their hegemony, control, and power. So we need to balance it. So between the internal problems that we need to deal with, and between the external challenges that we have to face, we need to chart a course that would always champion the issue of justice, the issue of equality, the issue of freedom, the issue of democracy. These are the values that we need to hear. I don't care, this is not about religion. These are not religious wars. I don't see the Israeli-Palestinian struggle as a religious war. In fact, I see that this is a great assault on Judaism itself, not just on Muslims and Christians. I see Zionists not just being a Jew Zionist. It could be a Christian Zionist, it could be a Muslim Zionist. And all of them are aggressors in my book. All of them have to be exposed, and all of them have to be confronted. And when we talk about the United States, I don't see the United States as all evil. I see the United States as a country that has been charting certain policies. These policies, if are going to affect these great values of justice, freedom, democracy, equality, then they have to be stood up to. They have to be confronted. And if they are going to actually support the self-determination of people, the freedom of people, then they have to be applauded. I mean, these are decisions made by people, and we have to take the right positions and the right stands when it comes to supporting these values. But I think it's been great discussion. Thank you very much for being part of this, and thank you always for directing it and moderating it.
We have run out of time. We've actually went over time. So I want to quickly say goodbye to all of our viewers, and this is our last presentation for today. Tomorrow, we have 2 sessions starting at 5:30 Istanbul time. We have the geopolitics of the global war on terror, and we have in the session 5 the alarming effects of the global war on terror. We have a panelist of very outstanding speakers, so I invite you to participate tomorrow live on Facebook. From Istanbul now, I will say goodbye and thank everybody for participating.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, everyone. Salam alaikum. Thank you.